This is a story about one word. One word spoken by one man in a room full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. One word that nobody expected. One word that changed everything. But before we get to that word, you need to understand something. In the entire history of the Galactic Concord, spanning 11,000 years, there have been 412 civilizations welcomed into membership. 412 species. 412 moments when a single individual stood in the Great Assembly Hall and received the most valuable gift in the known galaxy. 412 times, the answer was yes. Until humanity. My name is Ravan. I am a historian of the Galactic Concord. I have spent the last 40 years of my life studying one event. One moment. One man. And I am standing here today in front of you, my students, because I believe what happened that day is the most important thing I can teach you. Not because it was dramatic. Not because there was violence or war or some great military victory. Because of what one ordinary human being understood that 11,000 years of galactic civilization had somehow missed. The human who said no was not a leader. He was not a general. He was not a diplomat or a politician or a scientist. He was a teacher. He taught children in a small coastal town on the human homeworld. A town so small it did not appear on most human maps. His name was Callum Reese. He was 44 years old. He had never left his planet before the day we called him. And when we offered him everything, he looked at it carefully, thought about it quietly, and said no. 6 words followed that no. 6 simple words that every civilization in this Concord has been studying, debating, and teaching ever since. Let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you who he was. And let me tell you what those 6 words meant. Because I have spent 40 years trying to understand them. And I think I finally do. The town was called Fennec. It sat on the western coast of a large island that humans called Britain, on the planet Earth, in the Sol system. It was the kind of town that did not ask to be noticed. It had a harbor where fishing boats went out in the mornings and came back in the evenings. It had a main street with a bakery and a hardware store and a small library that Callum visited every Thursday without fail. It had a school where 230 children between the ages of 5 and 16 came every morning to learn things. Callum had been teaching at that school for 19 years. He taught history and what humans called social studies, which was the study of how people lived together and organized themselves and treated each other across different times and places. He was good at it. Not good in the way that gets you awards or recognition or your name in publications. Good in the way that matters. The way that makes children actually understand things. The way that makes a 15-year-old sit up straighter because something just landed in their mind and they can feel it settling in. His students liked him. Not in the way students like teachers who are easy. In the way students like teachers who are fair. Who tell the truth. Who treat a question from the back row with the same respect as a question from the front. Who do not pretend things are simple when they are not, but who also do not pretend things are complicated when they are not. He was a tall man. A little thin. He had the kind of face that had not changed much since he was 30, just settled more firmly into itself. He wore the same style of jacket most days. He made his own lunch and ate it at his desk while reading. He walked to school every morning along the harbor road and noted what the weather was doing with the specific attention of someone who found the world genuinely interesting without needing it to be dramatic. He lived alone. He had done so for 6 years, since the end of a marriage that had been good for a long time and then quietly not good and then honestly over, ended with the specific sadness of 2 people who still respected each other and knew it was still the right thing. He had a dog named Porter who was old and slow and deeply satisfied with his life. He had 3 friends he had known since university and saw twice a year. He called his mother every Sunday. He was, by every measure available, an ordinary man. He was also, in ways that the Galactic Concord selection system had somehow identified and that Callum himself would have argued against if you had explained it to him, exactly the right person for what was about to happen. On a Tuesday morning in October, Callum was in the middle of explaining to a room of 14-year-olds why the same historical mistakes kept happening across different centuries when there was a knock at his classroom door. He finished his sentence. He always finished his sentences before answering doors. His students knew this about him. Then he opened the door. A woman was standing in the corridor. She was perhaps 35. Practical clothing. Alert eyes. The look of someone who was very good at their job and whose job was currently requiring them to do something unusual. She said, "Mr. Reese. My name is Nadia Osei. I work for the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office. I need to speak with you. It is important and it is going to take some time." Callum looked at her for a moment. He said, "I have 20 minutes left in this lesson." Nadia said, "I know. I can wait." He nodded. He closed the door. He went back to his students and finished the lesson properly. He set their reading for the next day. He waited until the last student had left before he went back to the door. He said, "All right. Tell me." Nadia told him. It took 45 minutes. Callum listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions when she was done. They were the 3 most important questions anyone could have asked, and Nadia, who had briefed 6 other candidates before the selection committee chose Callum, would later say that the questions alone told her the selection had been correct. The first question was, "What exactly is in this gift?" The second question was, "What happens to the species that receives it?" The third question was, "Why me?" Nadia answered all 3 carefully and honestly. For the third question, she said the truth, which was that the Concord selection process looked for someone who was not powerful, not ambitious, and not invested in the political outcome of accepting or refusing. Someone whose response would come from who they were rather than what they wanted. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do we leave?" The Galactic Concord had been doing this for 11,000 years. The tradition was called the welcoming gift. It was the oldest continuous tradition in Concord history, older than most of its member civilizations, older than the assembly hall itself. The idea behind it was simple. When a new species reached a certain point in their development, a point measured not just by technology but by a combination of factors that the Concord's philosophers had spent centuries refining, the Concord extended an invitation. "Come join us." And with the invitation came a gift. The gift was the archive. 11,000 years of accumulated knowledge from every civilization that had ever been part of the Concord. Science, medicine, engineering, mathematics, philosophy, art, history. Every discovery made by every species across every century of Concord membership, organized and preserved and offered freely to the newest member. It was, by any measure, the most valuable thing in the galaxy. Every species that had ever received it had accepted immediately. Some had wept. Some had performed elaborate ceremonial responses. Some had stood in silence for long minutes before speaking. But all of them, every single one across 411 previous offerings, had said yes. The effect on receiving species was transformative. A civilization that might have taken 3 centuries to develop certain technologies could do it in 30 years with the archive. Medical advances that might have cost millions of lives to reach through trial and error were available immediately. The archive did not just advance a species. It reshaped what was possible for them. This was the point. The Concord believed, genuinely and deeply, that the archive was the kindest thing it could do for a new member. It was not charity in a way that diminished the receiver. It was a sharing. A welcome. A gesture that said, "You are part of us now, and what we know is yours." The selection of the individual who would receive the gift on behalf of their species was taken seriously. The Concord did not want a politician. Politicians accepted things based on strategy. The Concord did not want a scientist. Scientists accepted things based on curiosity. The Concord did not want a military leader. Military leaders accepted things based on advantage. The Concord wanted someone whose response would be honest. Someone who would receive the gift as a person rather than as a representative of an agenda. Someone whose yes would mean yes in the purest sense. Their selection process was sophisticated and had been refined over millennia. It looked for specific qualities. Intellectual honesty. Genuine curiosity. The capacity to think carefully under pressure. the absence of personal ambition that might distort the response. It had selected Callum Reese. Nadia had been surprised by the selection. Not because she thought he was wrong. Because he was more ordinary than most selections she had seen. She had expected someone with more visible distinction. A researcher. A philosopher. Someone whose background suggested the kind of thinking the Concord was looking for. What she had not expected was a secondary school teacher from Fenwick. What she had not expected was that in 45 minutes of conversation in a school corridor, she would understand completely why the selection system had found him. The journey to the Concord assembly station took 3 weeks. Callum had never been on a spacecraft before. He approached this with the same attention he brought to anything new. He was not anxious. He was curious. He asked questions about how things worked, not to appear interested but because he actually wanted to know. Nadia had accompanied new species representatives before. She had a standard briefing process that she had developed over years of doing this work. She knew how to explain large things to people who were encountering them for the first time. Callum was different from her previous assignments. Most representatives she had accompanied were overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening and spent much of the journey managing that overwhelm. Callum was not overwhelmed. He was paying attention. On the 4th day he asked her to describe the archive in detail. She spent 2 hours doing so. He listened. He asked specific questions. He wanted to understand not just what the archive contained but how it worked. How the knowledge was transferred. How it was accessed. What it felt like, if that was something she could describe, for a species to suddenly have access to 11,000 years of knowledge they had not accumulated themselves. Nadia told him what she knew. She said the comparison most species used was like being handed a library. Everything in it immediately available. Nothing behind locked doors. No years of study required to access the advanced sections. All of it, from the most basic to the most complex, immediately available to anyone who wanted it. Callum was quiet for a moment. He said, "Did any of the species who received it continue their own research afterward?" Nadia thought about it. She said yes, most of them did. Callum said, in the same areas that were already in the archive. Nadia thought about this more carefully. She said she was not certain. Callum said, "I would be interested to know." He went back to looking out the viewport. On the 9th day he asked her about the Concord itself. Not its history, which she had already covered. Its culture. How decisions were made. What the member civilizations argued about. What they agreed on without argument. What the Concord valued most. Nadia answered all of this. On the 14th day he asked her something she had not been asked before by any representative she had accompanied. He said, "Do you think we should accept it?" Nadia said, "That is not my role to advise on." Callum said, "I know. I am asking what you think. Not what you are supposed to say." Nadia looked at him. She said, "I think it would be extraordinary for humanity. The advances it would enable are almost impossible to imagine." Callum said, "That is not what I asked." Nadia was quiet for a moment. She said, "I think it is more complicated than it looks." Callum nodded slowly. He said, "Yes. That is what I think too." He did not say anything else about it for the remaining 9 days of the journey. But Nadia noticed that he spent a great deal of time thinking. Not anxious thinking. Careful thinking. The specific quality of someone who had taken a question seriously and was not going to stop examining it until they had looked at it from every angle available. On the last night before arrival she asked him if he was ready. He said, "I know what I think." "Yes." She said, "What do you think?" He smiled. It was a small smile. The kind that meant something had been decided. He said, "You will hear it when everyone else does. It would not be fair to tell you first." The Concord assembly station was the largest structure Callum had ever seen. This was not a comparison he made lightly. He had seen photographs and documentary footage of it during the journey. He had been told its dimensions. He had tried to prepare himself for the scale of it. He had not succeeded. It hung in space like a small moon that had been carefully organized into something functional. Its surface was covered in the architectural signatures of dozens of different civilizations, each section built by a different species across different centuries, the whole thing an accidental record of 11,000 years of galactic history written in metal and light and materials that had no human names. The docking approach took 40 minutes. Callum watched it the whole time from the forward viewport. He did not speak during this period. He simply watched, with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that deserved it. As they docked, Nadia said, 412 civilizations are represented here. You will see beings today that no human has ever seen before. Some of them will be very different from anything in your experience. I want you to know that all of them know who you are and why you are here. Callum said, are they expecting me to say yes? Nadia said, yes. Everyone always says yes. Callum said, all right. He stood up and straightened his jacket. The docking clamps engaged. The airlock opened. Callum Reese, secondary school teacher from Fenwick, stepped out into the Concord assembly station and into the most consequential moment in human diplomatic history. He looked around at the corridor beyond the airlock. At the scale of it. At the beings moving through it from a dozen different civilizations. At the light that came from sources he could not identify in colors that were slightly different from anything on Earth. He took it all in. Then he said to Nadia, quietly, it is bigger than I expected. Nadia said, everyone says that. Callum said, I imagined so. They walked. The corridor led to a reception area where a Concord protocol officer met them. The officer was from a species Callum had not seen before, tall and narrow with large amber eyes that moved independently of each other. The officer was professional and courteous and explained the schedule for the following day. The ceremony would begin at the 3rd hour of the station's morning cycle. Callum would be escorted to the assembly hall. He would stand at the offering platform. Prime Archon Zelath would present the gift formally. Callum would accept. The ceremony would conclude. The officer said all of this with the comfortable confidence of someone describing a process that had not varied in 11,000 years. Callum listened politely. He thanked the officer. He was shown to his quarters. That night, alone in a room that had been designed to approximate human comfort based on specifications the Concord had requested from the Human Diplomatic Office, Callum sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He was not afraid. He was not second-guessing himself. He was simply sitting with what he had decided. The way you sit with a decision that you know is right and that you also know is going to be difficult. Not difficult for you. Difficult for everyone else in the room. He thought about his students. He thought about the lessons he had taught about history. About the moments when individuals had made choices that seemed impossible from the outside and that seemed, from the inside, like the only honest option available. He thought about what he was going to say tomorrow. He had known for several days now. 6 words. Simple ones. True ones. He went to sleep. The assembly hall was built to make you feel small. Not in a cruel way. Not in the way of a place designed to intimidate. In the way of a place designed to make you understand that what happened here was larger than any one being. Larger than any one civilization. The architects who had built it 11,000 years ago had understood that the most important moments in history needed a room that matched their weight. The ceiling was so high that the upper portions were lost in a soft blue light that had no visible source. The walls curved inward in a gentle arc that wrapped the space like cupped hands. The floor was a single continuous surface of dark polished material that reflected everything above it, so that when you looked down you saw the room again, inverted, going down as far as it went up. The seating rose in tiers from the central floor. Tier after tier after tier. Each tier holding the representatives of different civilizations. 412 of them. Some sitting in the human sense. Some resting in ways that had no human equivalent. Some occupying their spaces in ways that Callum's eyes took a moment to fully process. All of them watching the central floor. Watching him. Callum walked to the offering platform with Nadia 2 steps behind him. His footsteps made a sound on the polished floor that was absorbed quickly by the size of the room. He walked at his normal pace. Not too fast. Not performing slowness either. just walking the way he walked. He reached the platform and stopped. The platform was a raised circle about 3 meters across. Simple. No ornamentation. In 11,000 years it had not needed any. What happened on it was sufficient. Callum stood on it and looked up at the tiers. 412 civilizations looked back at him. He did not look overwhelmed. He looked interested. In the historian section near the upper tiers, a young Concord scholar named Ravan had his recording equipment active and his full attention on the human below. Ravan was 26 years old and had been assigned to document the ceremony as part of his training. He had documented 3 previous welcoming ceremonies. They had all been similar. Formal. Warm. Efficient. The receiving representative stood on the platform, accepted the gift, and the galaxy welcomed its newest full member. He expected this one to be the same. He noticed something about the human that he later wrote about extensively. The human was not performing anything. Every previous representative Ravan had documented had been performing something. Dignity. Humility. Gratitude. Joy. These were real emotions, but they were also being managed, shaped for the room, expressed in ways that communicated to the assembled Concord what the receiving species wanted to communicate. The human was just standing there, looking at the room with the same expression he might use to look at anything worth understanding. Prime Archon Zelath entered from the high ceremonial entrance at the far end of the hall. The room shifted in a particular way that rooms shift when the most important person in them arrives. Zelath was old. Ancient, by most species standards. He had been Prime Archon for longer than most current Concord member civilizations had been members. He was tall and very thin and moved with the specific slowness of someone who had learned that there was no situation in the galaxy that required hurrying. His skin was a deep grey-green that shifted slightly as he moved, catching light in ways that suggested there was more happening beneath the surface than was visible from outside. He had presided over 19 welcoming ceremonies. He had never seen one go differently than expected. He walked to the platform. He stood across from Callum. He looked at the human for a moment with the patient attention of someone who found new species genuinely interesting and had not yet lost this quality despite 11,000 years of Concord history suggesting that most things eventually became familiar. He said, in the formal ceremonial language of the Concord that was simultaneously translated into every language in the hall, Callum Reese of the human species. You stand today at the threshold of full membership in the Galactic Concord. You stand here as representative of your people. What you receive today, you receive on behalf of every human who has ever lived and every human who will ever live. He paused. The hall was completely silent. Welcome, he said. We are glad you are here. Zelath began the formal presentation. He had given this presentation 19 times before. He knew it completely. He did not need to think about the words. He had, in fact, stopped thinking about the words several ceremonies ago and focused instead on watching the receiving representative's face as the scope of the gift became clear to them. He liked this moment. He liked watching understanding arrive. He said, the Concord gift is the archive. It contains the complete recorded knowledge of every civilization that has been part of this Concord since its founding 11,000 years ago. Every discovery in science. Every advance in medicine. Every engineering solution. Every philosophical framework. Every artistic tradition. Every mathematical proof. Every historical record. He let that sit for a moment. It contains the solutions to problems your species has not yet encountered. It contains the answers to questions your scientists have not yet thought to ask. It contains medical knowledge that will save lives that would otherwise be lost. It contains technologies that will take your species to places you have not yet imagined. He looked at Callum directly. Every species that has received the archive has been transformed by it. Not changed. Not diminished. Made more capable of becoming what they were always meant to become. The archive does not replace your path. It lights it. He paused. This gift is offered freely. Without condition. Without expectation of return. It is our way of saying, you are part of us now, and what we know belongs to you as much as it belongs to any of us. The hall was warm with the specific atmosphere of a moment that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived. Zelaith prepared to ask the formal acceptance question. This was the last step of the presentation. He would ask. The representative would say yes. The archive would be formally transferred. The ceremony would conclude with a welcome unlike anything any human had experienced before. He opened his mouth to ask the question. Callum spoke first. He said, "May I ask something before you continue?" The hall was silent in a different way than it had been silent before. Zelaith paused. In 19 ceremonies, no representative had ever spoken before the acceptance question was asked. He said, "Of course." Callum said, "You described the archive as containing the accumulated knowledge of 412 civilizations across 11,000 years." Zelaith said, "Yes." Callum said, "Was that knowledge discovered or was it given?" Zelaith looked at him. He said, "I am not certain I understand the distinction." Callum nodded. He said it simply, the way he explained things to his students when a concept needed to be broken down into its basic parts. He said, when the first civilization joined the Concord, they had no archive to receive. They had only what they had learned themselves. Through their own work. Their own experiments. Their own failures and their own discoveries. They earned their knowledge. They built it. It cost them time and effort and lives and generations of work. That knowledge meant something specific to them because of what it cost to get it. Zelaith said, "Yes." Callum said, when the second civilization joined, they received the archive of the first. They got, immediately and freely, everything the first civilization had spent centuries earning. Zelaith said, "Yes. That is the nature of the gift." Callum said, "My question is this. Of the 412 civilizations in the archive, how many of them built their foundational knowledge themselves? And how many of them received it from someone else?" The hall was very quiet. Zelaith was quiet for a moment. He was not a being who was often surprised. He was surprised now. He said, "The early civilizations built their knowledge. Later civilizations received more than they built." Callum said, "So the archive contains mostly knowledge that was discovered by a small number of early civilizations and then passed forward. The later civilizations received more and built less." Zelaith said, "That is accurate." Callum said, "And the species who received more than they built, are they the same as the early ones who built everything themselves? In terms of what they are capable of? In terms of how they think? In terms of who they are?" Zelaith was quiet for a longer moment. In the historian's tier, Rivan had stopped breathing. He was 26 years old. He had studied 11,000 years of Concord history. He had never heard anyone ask this question. He looked around at the tiers. At the 412 civilizations. He watched their representatives. He watched the stillness that had settled over the hall. Not the polite stillness of ceremony. The real stillness of a room that has just heard something it needs time to think about. Nadia, standing to the side of the platform, had her eyes on Callum. She understood now what he had meant on the ship when he said it was more complicated than it looked. She understood what was about to happen. Zelaith said, "Carefully, you are asking whether receiving knowledge is the same as earning it." Callum said, "Yes." Zelaith said, "These are not things I have been asked to consider in this context before." Callum said, "I know. I am sorry. I do not mean any disrespect. I think what you are offering is genuinely generous. I think you mean it as a kindness. I believe that completely." He paused. He said, "I just need to understand what we would be accepting before I can tell you whether we should accept it." The hall waited. Zelaith looked at Callum with the attention of someone encountering a situation their experience had not prepared them for and who was handling this by being very still and very present. He said, "What have you concluded?" Callum said, "I think humanity should say no." The hall did not erupt. It did not fill with noise or movement or the outward signs of shock. It went quieter, which was somehow larger than noise would have been. 412 civilizations going quieter simultaneously was a thing you could feel. Zelaith said, "No. Not as a question. As a repetition. As someone making sure they had heard correctly. Callum said, "No. Thank you. But no." Zile said, "You understand what you are refusing?" Callum said, "Yes." Zile said, "You are refusing 11,000 years of knowledge. Medical advances that will save human lives. Technologies that will protect your people. Solutions to problems that will cost you centuries to solve on your own." Callum said, "Yes. I understand that." Zile said, "No species has ever refused this gift." Callum said, "I know." Zile said, "May I ask why?" The hall waited. Callum stood on the platform. A teacher from a small coastal town. A man who walked to work along a harbor road and ate lunch at his desk and had a slow old dog named Porter waiting for him at home. He said 6 words. 6 simple words in a clear, steady voice that carried across the hall. He said, "We need to find it ourselves." The silence that followed those 6 words was the longest silence the assembly hall had contained in 11,000 years of hosting the most consequential conversations in galactic history. Zelath stood very still. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "That is all." Callum said, "That is everything." In the historian's tier, Ravan wrote the 6 words down. He wrote them in his personal notes, not the official record. He wrote them and then looked at them and felt something that he did not have a word for. Something that arrived in his chest and stayed there. We need to find it ourselves. He looked at the human standing on the platform below. He looked at the hall around him. 412 civilizations. Most of whom had received more knowledge than they had built. Most of whom had their foundations handed to them by the species that came before. Most of whom had never been asked whether receiving was the same as earning. He looked back at his notes. 6 words. He thought he might spend a long time thinking about those 6 words. He was right. The ceremony did not conclude in the way it had concluded 411 times before. It concluded differently. Quietly. Without the formal welcome sequence, because the formal welcome sequence assumed acceptance and Zelath did not think it appropriate to perform a welcome that the human had not accepted. He closed the ceremony with the simple acknowledgement that the offer remained open and that humanity was welcome to reconsider at any time. Callum thanked him. He meant it. He walked off the platform with Nadia and they went back through the corridor to the diplomatic quarter. Nadia did not speak for the first 10 minutes. When she did, she said, "You knew before we left Earth." Callum said, "I knew by the end of the first week of the journey." Nadia said, "You could have told me." Callum said, "It would not have changed anything. And I did not want you to spend 2 weeks trying to talk me out of it." Nadia said, "Would I have been able to?" Callum thought about it honestly. He said, "No." Nadia stopped walking. She turned to look at him. She said, "Do you understand what you just did? Not just for humanity. For the relationship between humanity and the Concord. For every human who comes after you." Callum said, "I think so." Nadia said, "You refused the most valuable gift in the galaxy." Callum said, "Yes." Nadia said, "Because you think humanity needs to earn its knowledge." Callum said, "I think we need to be the people who found it. Not the people who were given it. There is a difference between those 2 things and I think that difference matters more than everything in the archive." Nadia looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Most people would not have said no." Callum said, "I know." She said, "You are a secondary school teacher from a town nobody has heard of." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you just stood in the largest diplomatic space in the galaxy and refused the greatest gift ever offered to any species." He said, "Yes." She said, "How do you feel?" He thought about it. He said, "Hungry. Is there somewhere we can get something to eat?" Nadia looked at him. Then she laughed. It was sudden and genuine and entirely appropriate to the moment. The specific laugh of someone releasing something that had been held very tightly. She said, "Yes. There is." They walked. Behind them, in the assembly hall, Prime Archon Zelath stood alone on the offering platform. The hall had emptied. The 412 civilizations had returned to their quarters and their ships and their conversations about what had just happened. Zelaith stood on the platform for a long time. He had been Prime Archon for longer than most member civilizations had existed. He had seen everything the galaxy had to offer in terms of unexpected moments. He had believed, genuinely, that a welcoming ceremony could not surprise him anymore. He thought about 6 words. He thought about a teacher from a small town who had looked at 11,000 years of accumulated galactic knowledge and decided that his species needed to find it themselves. He had called the gift a kindness. He stood in the empty hall and wondered, for the first time in a very long time, whether he had been right about that. Later that evening, Zelaith sent a message to the human diplomatic quarters requesting a private meeting with Callum before his departure. The message was brief and formal. Callum accepted. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. It lasted 3 hours. No official record was made of it. What was said in that room was between 2 beings. One who had given the same gift for 19 ceremonies and had never questioned it. One who had refused it and could explain why in 6 words and in 3 hours and in every quiet moment of a life lived with that decision settled inside him like something true. Nadia was not present. She would later ask Callum what they had talked about. He would say, he wanted to understand. So I tried to explain it. She would say, did he understand? Callum would say, I think he did. By the end, I think he understood more than I expected him to. She would say, what did he say at the end? Callum would look at the viewport of the ship taking them home. He would say, he said thank you. And then he said he needed to think about some things for a while. And I told him I thought that was a good idea. Callum came home on a Thursday. The journey back took 3 weeks, the same as the journey out. Nadia accompanied him to the edge of human space and then her duties took her elsewhere. They said goodbye at the transfer station with the specific warmth of 2 people who had shared something large and knew they would probably not see each other again. Nadia said, I want you to know something. Callum said, all right. She said, I have been doing this work for 11 years. I have helped prepare humanity for more diplomatic moments than I can count. I have sat in rooms where important things were decided and I have watched important people decide them. She paused. She said, what you did in that hall was the most important thing I have ever watched a human being do. And I want you to know that I think you were right. I did not think so when you walked off that platform. I thought you had made a terrible mistake. I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks and I think you were right. Callum looked at her. He said, thank you. That means something to me. She nodded. She left. He took the connecting transport home. Then a smaller regional vessel. Then a ground vehicle from the nearest large city. He arrived in Fennec on a grey Thursday afternoon when the harbour was quiet and the sky was the specific shade of white that meant rain was coming but had not decided when. He walked home from the transport stop along the harbour road. Porter heard him coming before he reached the door. The old dog moved to greet him with the careful enthusiasm of an animal who was too old for jumping but not too old for feeling. Callum crouched down and scratched behind his ears for a long time. He said, hello, old boy. Porter leaned against his leg. They went inside. Callum made tea. He stood at his kitchen window and looked at the harbour while the kettle heated. The fishing boats were in. The lights were coming on in the buildings along the waterfront. It was exactly as it had always been. He drank his tea. He went to bed at his normal time. The following Monday he went back to school. His students knew where he had been. The whole town knew. It had been in the news, the fact of his selection, the fact that he had travelled to the Concord assembly station. What had happened there was not yet widely known. The official diplomatic communications were still being processed. The human government was still determining how to present the situation publicly. His students watched him walk into the classroom with the specific attention of people who know that someone they see every day has just done something enormous and are not sure how to hold both versions of the person simultaneously. Callum set his bag down. He looked at them. He said, I know you have questions. I will answer what I can after the lesson. Right now we have work to do. He taught the lesson. Afterward he answered questions for 45 minutes. He was honest. He told them what had happened in simple terms. He told them what he had said and why he had said it. He did not make it dramatic. He did not make it small either. One student, a 15-year-old named Priya who sat in the third row and asked the best questions of anyone in the school, said, "Were you scared?" Callum thought about it honestly. He said, "No. I knew what I thought was right." When you know that, the size of the room does not change very much. Priya said, "What if you were wrong?" Callum said, "Then I was wrong for the right reasons." That is the best any of us can do. Priya wrote this down. She was not the only one. 6 months after his return, Nadia came to Fenwick. She drove down the harbour road and found his house and knocked on the door on a Saturday morning when the weather had finally decided to be good about things. Callum made tea. They sat at his kitchen table. She said, "The Concord is talking about it. Constantly. Every diplomatic channel we have is full of it. 37 civilizations have formally requested more information about humanity's reasons. 12 have asked for academic access to human philosophical traditions. 3 have asked whether a human scholar would be willing to address the Concord on the subject of how humans think about knowledge and discovery." Callum said, "What did the government say?" Nadia said, "They said yes to all of it. They are being very careful about how they frame it politically. There are people who are angry. People who think you cost humanity centuries of advancement." Callum said, "I know." Nadia said, "Are you bothered by that?" He thought about it. He said, "I think they are not wrong that it will cost us time. I think they are wrong that time is what we were trading. But I understand why they see it that way." Nadia said, "What do you think we were trading?" Callum wrapped both hands around his mug. He said, "Who we would be when we got there. If we take everything from the archive and build our future on top of someone else's foundations, we will get where we are going faster. But we will not be the people who got there. We will be the people who were carried. And I think there is something we would lose in that. Something important. Something that you cannot get back once it is gone." Nadia was quiet. She said, "You explained this to Zelaith." Callum said, "I tried to." She said, "What did he say?" Callum looked at the harbour through his kitchen window. He said he had been giving the same gift for a very long time and had always believed it was the kindest thing he could do. And then he was quiet for a while. And then he said that he wondered whether kindness and what is good for someone are always the same thing. Nadia said, "That is a large thought for someone in his position." Callum said, "He is a large thinker. I liked him very much." She left in the afternoon. Callum walked Porter along the harbour road in the evening. He went to bed at his normal time. He went to school on Monday. His life was the same and entirely different, and he was at peace with both of these things being true simultaneously. The news reached every corner of the Concord within a month. Not because it was announced dramatically. Because 412 civilizations had been in the assembly hall that day, and 412 civilizations went home and told someone what they had seen. A species had said no. This fact traveled through the Concord the way genuinely surprising things travel. Not like news, which moves fast and is forgotten. Like a question, which moves slower and stays. The initial responses were varied. Some civilizations found it baffling. They reviewed the record of the ceremony repeatedly looking for the part where the human changed his mind. When they confirmed that no such part existed, they moved on to trying to understand why. Their philosophers argued about it. Their historians contextualized it. Their diplomats sent formal inquiries to human representatives asking for clarification. Some civilizations found it offensive. Not at the human. At themselves. Because they had received the archive. Because they had said yes without hesitation. Because 6 simple words spoken by a teacher from a small town had made them wonder, for the first time, what they had given up by accepting. Some civilizations found it admirable in a way they could not fully explain. These were the ones who studied it most seriously. The 6 words were translated into every language in the Concord within the first year. This was not unusual. Important statements were routinely translated. What was unusual was that the translations generated significant academic debate in many civilizations because the 6 words meant subtly different things depending on which language received them and which cultural framework interpreted them. In one language, we need to find it ourselves translated most closely as we require the dignity of our own discovery. In another it translated as the journey belongs to us and cannot be given. In a third it translated as something closer to we are not finished becoming who we will be. Each translation was studied, debated, published, taught. 15 years after the ceremony, a Concord academic institution published the first comprehensive comparative study of all 412 translations of the 6 words. The study was 400 pages long. It concluded that the 6 words were what linguists called a deep statement, one whose meaning expanded rather than contracted the more carefully you examined it. The study became required reading in 17 Concord academic curricula. 20 years after the ceremony, a Concord philosophical movement emerged that took the 6 words as its founding principle. The movement argued that the archive, while genuinely valuable, had created a form of intellectual dependency in many receiving civilizations. That species who received more than they built had developed differently, and not always in ways that were obvious as differences, from species who had built their foundations through their own work. The movement was controversial. It upset civilizations who had received the archive and who did not want to examine what that receiving had cost them. It generated some of the most significant philosophical arguments in Concord history. Prime Archon Zelaith did not comment publicly on any of this. He retired from his position as Prime Archon 4 years after the ceremony. In his retirement address he said one thing that was noted and recorded and discussed for decades afterward. He said, "I have learned more from one refusal than from 411 acceptances. I leave this role grateful for that education." He did not explain further. He did not need to. 30 years after the ceremony, the Concord formally amended the welcoming gift tradition for the first time in its 11,000-year history. The amendment did not end the tradition. It added something to it. From that point forward, after the archive was presented and before the acceptance question was asked, the ceremony included a new element. A reading. 6 words, in the language of the receiving species, followed by a moment of silence. The receiving representative was not told what the words meant or where they came from before the ceremony. They were told afterward. Every receiving species since the amendment has been curious about the 6 words. Some have changed their answer because of them. Most have still said yes. But they have said yes differently, with more awareness of what they were accepting and what that acceptance meant. Which was, in the end, what Callum had wanted. Not for everyone to say no. For everyone to understand what they were saying yes to. Rivan had been 26 years old when he sat in the historian's tier and wrote 6 words in his personal notes. He was 67 now. 41 years of his life had been shaped by those 6 words. Not consumed by them. Shaped by them, the way a river is shaped by the geography it moves through, the geography becoming part of how the water moves long after the water has left. He had spent the first decade after the ceremony doing what historians do. Gathering evidence. Building a comprehensive record of the event. Interviewing witnesses. Reviewing the official documentation. Cross-referencing the diplomatic communications that surrounded it. He had produced a definitive historical account. It was the most cited document in Concord scholarship on human civilization. It had been translated into more languages than almost any other academic work of his generation. But the historical account was not what he cared most about. What he cared most about was the question the ceremony had planted in him that day when he was 26 and had stopped breathing for a moment in the historian's tier. The question was not about humanity. It was about the Concord. Specifically, it was about what the Concord had been doing for 11,000 years without understanding it fully. Giving knowledge away. Giving it with genuine generosity. Giving it with real love for the receiving species. And in doing so, perhaps, giving away something the receiving species needed to keep. He had spent 30 years studying this question. He had looked at the long-term development of civilizations who had received the archive early against civilizations who had received it late. He had looked at innovation rates, at the specific quality of discoveries made after archive receipt versus discoveries made before. He had looked at how civilizations talked about their own knowledge, whether they described it as something they possessed or something they had been given. The differences were subtle. They were not absolute. Many civilizations had received the archive and thrived in every measurable way. Many had grown into extraordinary members of the Concord community. But there were patterns. Quiet ones. Patterns that suggested something real about the relationship between a species and the knowledge it had earned versus the knowledge it had received. He had published 3 papers on this. Each one more carefully argued than the last. Each one more controversial. He had also, 30 years into his research, done something that surprised him. He had gone to Earth. He had visited Fenwick. Callum Rees had been 74 years old. Retired from teaching for 10 years. Still walking the harbour road every morning. Still slow and careful and genuinely interested in the world. They had met in a small restaurant near the harbour where Callum ate lunch on Tuesdays. Rivan had brought his research. All of it. 30 years of work. He had shown Callum what he had found. What the data suggested. What the patterns implied. Callum had looked at it carefully. Asked questions. Thought about it. He had said, I did not know any of this when I said no. Rivan had said, I know. Callum had said, I said no because it felt wrong. Not because I had data. Rivan had said, I know that too. Callum had said, does that change anything? Rivan had thought about it. He had said, no. I think you understood something true without needing the data to prove it. That is not less valid. In some ways it is more interesting. They had talked for 4 hours. Rivan had gone back to his work with something he had not had before. Not new data. A sense of completion. He had spent 30 years trying to understand what Callum had understood in 3 weeks on a spacecraft traveling to the most important meeting of his life. He had gotten there eventually. The route had taken longer. But he had gotten there. Which was, he thought, possibly the point. Rivan finished his lecture. He looked at his students. They were young. Most of them in their 20s. Sharp and curious and full of the specific energy of people who have chosen to spend their lives trying to understand things. He had been exactly like them once. He said, I want to tell you the last piece of this story. The lecture hall was quiet. He said, Callum Rees continued teaching in Fenwick until he was 64 years old. 20 years after the ceremony. He taught the same subjects he had always taught. History. Social studies. How people live together and treat each other and organize their lives. He paused. When he retired, his students from across his entire career held a gathering for him. People came from all over. Former students who were now adults with their own children. Some who had moved far away and came back specifically for this. The gathering was held in the school hall where he had taught for 37 years. He paused again. Someone asked his former students to describe what Callum had taught them. Not the subjects. What he had actually taught them. The thing they carried with them. He looked at his students. The answers were different from each person. Different lessons remembered. Different moments. Different things he had said that had stayed with them. But there was one answer that came up again and again, from students across all the years he had taught. He said, they said he taught them that the struggle to understand something was not the obstacle to understanding it. The struggle was the understanding. That the work of finding an answer was not just the path to the answer. The work was what made the answer yours. The lecture hall was completely still. Rivan said, Callum Rees died at the age of 81. He died in Fenwick. In his house by the harbour. He had lived there for most of his life. He had never become famous in the way the galaxy expected. He had never sought any recognition for what he had done. He had gone home and taught children and walked his dog along the harbour road and been satisfied with a life that did not need the galaxy to notice it. He paused. The Concord sent a formal memorial acknowledgement. It was the first time in 11,000 years that the Concord had formally acknowledged the death of a single non-Arcan individual from a member species. The acknowledgement was signed by the current Prime Arcan and by the representatives of every member civilization. He paused one final time. It said simply, "The galaxy is grateful." The hall was silent. Rivan looked at his notes. He had taught this lecture for 15 years. He had given it to hundreds of students. It never felt routine. It never felt like something he had done before. Because the thing at the center of it was not something you got used to. He said, "I have spent 40 years studying Callum Reese and the 6 words he spoke in this assembly hall. 40 years of research and data and papers and arguments and one Tuesday lunch in a small restaurant in a town that does not appear on most maps." He looked at his students. "And here is what I have concluded." He said it slowly. The greatest thing Callum Reese did was not refuse the archive. Anyone can refuse something. Refusing is easy if you are stubborn enough. He paused. The greatest thing he did was understand why. He paused again. He understood that what a species discovers about the universe matters less than what a species discovers about itself in the process of looking. He understood that the value of knowledge is not only in what it tells you about the world outside. It is in what the search for it tells you about who you are. He understood that a species handed all the answers is not the same species it would have been if it had found those answers on its own. He looked at the back of the hall. And he understood this not because he was a diplomat or a scientist or a philosopher. He understood it because he was a teacher. Because he had spent 37 years watching children struggle to understand things. And watching what happened to them when they finally did. And knowing the difference between a student who is handed an answer and a student who finds one. He gathered his notes. He said one last thing. We need to find it ourselves. 6 words. The most studied sentence in 4 centuries of Concord history. Argued over. Translated into 400 languages. Written into ceremony. Referenced in 1,000 academic papers. He looked at his students one final time. I think he would find all of that somewhat excessive. I think he would say the words were not complicated. I think he would say he was just telling the truth. He nodded once. That will be all for today. The students left slowly. They left the way people leave a room when they are not quite finished with something the room gave them. Rivan stood alone in the lecture hall. The assembly hall where Callum had stood was 3 levels below this one. The same building. Different room. But the same building where a teacher from a small coastal town had looked at the most valuable gift in the galaxy and said no thank you. Rivan thought about what it meant to spend your whole life in a building where that had happened. He thought about a slow old dog named Porter. He thought about a harbor road. He thought about a man who had been asked to represent his entire species and had done so by being exactly who he was. No more. No less. Exactly who he was. He thought about 6 words. He thought about what it meant that after 40 years of studying them he still found new things in them. He thought that this was probably the point too. He picked up his notes. He turned off the light. He walked out of the lecture hall and into the corridor of the assembly station. Around him the station moved with the business of 412 civilizations going about their days. Beings of every shape and size and biological architecture. Representatives of 11,000 years of history. Members of the largest community of minds the galaxy had ever assembled. All of them here. All of them part of something that had been built over a very long time. And somewhere far away, on a small planet in the Sol system, on the western coast of an island called Britain, in a town called Fennec that did not appear on most maps, children were going to school. They did not know what they would find there. That was the whole point.